Hi, everybody. We're back with Paul Hopcraft. And talking about today, we're talking innovation. And we're going to continue our discussions that we've been having over the last few video chats, talking about the idea of the work mat. So I'm going to share the work mat for just a second on my screen. One of the things I want to do is come back and talk about the fact of why we created the work mat and what it means for us. One of the things that Paul and I both felt was that we needed to create a way to help organizations think about how they could make innovation become a sort of common practice, but then enable organizations to remove barriers and create a, what we like to say, an environment in which innovation thrives. And you'll see that we've talked about strategic alignment, we've talked about the structure and governance, and today we're going to be talking about common language. You'll notice that common language is sitting right there in the middle of the work map. What I want to do is bring it back to Paul for a second, and we'll leave that and say, Paul, tell us a little bit about why we put that common language, context, and communication in the center of the work map.
I will, because I think both you and I see it as the natural glue. It holds everything together of the work mat. If you don't align and communicate, if you don't provide a common understanding, if you don't give a context to your innovation, then you can look at culture, you can look at the environment, look at government, but all these things stay islands of good approach. But bringing them together, locking them in, that glue, which is why we said running through the middle of our work must become language, communications, and context. I think the second point is why so many? Why common language? Why communications? Why context? Well, they all actually are interlinked. If you don't have a common language, you can't communicate. And if you can't communicate, you won't get the context. So we think all three need to be given a weighting within this. And my third point is that the middle, it's there because it is up to the leaders to actually drive the communication, build the common language, encourage the content and the context of what and how innovation takes place. And if you notice within our map, we've got the strategic alignment going across and we've got running down the middle. Now, lo and behold, that could arguably be a T skill. So tell me a bit more about what you think a T skill is, Jeffrey, to sort of emphasize what that means.
Well, you and I had talked about this before, and I agree with you fully, is that the idea of the strategy across the top is that broad capability of thinking about strategy, but that really vital center is around communication and language. And that's getting us back to the T idea that a lot of people talk about is necessary for good innovation. Good innovators will often be T-shaped. And I want to go back to a few things that you talked about as well. One was the idea of common language. It seems simple in some ways. And so, in fact, it seems almost ridiculous that we would need to define languages for ourselves around things like innovation. But what you'll often discover is that you'll have people describing innovation and using the same word, but meaning very different things. Incremental innovation versus disruptive innovation, service innovation versus product innovation. And each one of those is freighted with different risks, different uncertainties, and different investments. And if we're not speaking about the same things, if we don't mean the same things when we talk about innovation, we create confusion. And when you layer that on top of the fact that innovation can already be a little bit risky or uncertain, when you create an uncommon language, when we're not speaking the same way or we're not communicating well, it creates a whole lot of challenge that's unnecessary and easily avoidable.
Yeah, I also think innovation isn't done by one particular group within a company. We've discussed that before. It's across everybody involved, from customer service to research and development to engineers, whatever. And each of those people do come with their own discipline and their own backgrounds. Bringing them together in a common language of understanding helps enable them to see their value, to see their parts, and to be able to bring it together, so they can talk to the marketing group, or they can pull out from the salespeople the understanding they need. So you do need this common understanding, this common language.
Mhm.
And today, I think we are seeing more taxonomies emerging across companies for nearly everything. It is one of the vital things that companies work on. So if you're dealing with sustainability, it's a taxonomy. If you're dealing with technology, there's a taxonomy. There's nothing wrong with that. To be honest, I think that does give you the glue. And I think innovation is no different.
Well, that not just the glue, but then let's think about, if we want to use that analogy, let's take it a little further and how the glue gets applied. You mentioned 3 points, and the second point you had was not just good common language, but you also talked about communication and who needs to lead it, because that's applying that sort of language glue that we've talked about. And in my mind, I think it's really incumbent upon the executive team and the executives who lead product groups or business groups to be very good about what they communicate. Don't just tell people that you want innovation. Tell them what you expect out of innovation. I want a new product. I want a new service. I want 40% more growth in this market space, whatever it is, but be very careful about how you communicate, what you demand, and how you use that communication. Because I think what happens in a lot of organizations is there's a lot of good intent around, we want more innovation as a communication platform, but then never telling people what that looks like, how it would be measured, how it would be funded. So there's a lot more good, consistent communication that needs to happen. And again, we're looking at the strategy across the top, which is the purview of the executives. Communication down the center, that's a flowing mechanism. And that communication needs to flow out of the executives and be clear. And it can't be clear if you're not sharing language, but it also needs to be consistent. And that means it needs to be repeated and reinforced. That's good communication.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked in the past about why we designed the map the way we did. So we've got this central pillar of you know, common language, content, context, and also communications. One side, we're looking at culture and we're looking at environment. That's more the informal, that's more the human dimension that needs to you need to be inspired, you need to be engaged. It's the way you create your environment is going to give you a much greater possibility of better value innovation.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, we've got the harder aspects, the function, the design, the governance, the structures, the processes. So you've got this formal and informal. To a large degree, the executive, by pushing down into the middle, it allows that middle to flow out to both sides, but also for both sides to flow in.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a push and it's a pull. So if the executive is engaged and is really encouraging this communication and engaged in making it happen and can explain what they're trying to do, the flow out and the flow back is going to come through that middle. And that's why we think not only is it glue, but one other thing, I think it's just got a stickiness value. It's really the point where it sticks and people identify with it and they say, this gives us the value, it gives us the talking points, this gives us the right place to come and to ensure the organization, as you rightly said, flows upwards and down, very much on the innovation they are trying to achieve.
Well, the other thing that we talked about before we joined the video was what happens if common language and communication is absent. If the work mat works as we'd like to draw it, that means you have this big gap in each one of these different functions that we call out. The strategy that you've defined, the structures, the culture, they're all working in their own little bubbles. And we're not communicating between them. We're not setting out a common context. We don't have common language. And so in the absence of good communication and good common language, it becomes much, much more difficult to pull all those things together and create the environment that you're trying to create. That's why I said earlier, I think people think, why would we need to work on our language? That seems obvious that we should already have a language in business. And I think it's because innovation is somewhat different. It pulls different teams together. It pulls different processes together. It's much more forward looking than other things that happen in a business. It's much more risky in some instances as well. And so when all those things are true, I think it's much more important to get your language and your communication right. And in the absence of doing that work, then you're off working in these little bubbles or isolated pockets. And in those cases, those things are going to spin slightly out of control. So I think actually in some regards, defining your language gives you greater control over the innovation and the environment that you're trying to work in.
I think, as you said, it can help solve differences and misunderstandings. That's number one. It can reduce the confusion and the inefficiencies that can take place. Three, it can take away some of the islands that we all work in, the silos that we work in. I think it also stops people from adapting different standards. They can get a more common approach. They can then really see they're reducing down the variability that is out there. And the whole point, like a good engineer as you are, Jeffrey, is to reduce down variability. And innovation has a huge amount of variability. So give yourself a chance, give yourself a break. And the best place to do it, I think, is creating this common language, this context, and this communicating mechanism. I think what we get out of it, and that's the important thing, is we've overcome a lot of the barriers, but the outcomes are a much greater propensity of innovating with better value, with better efficiency, better use of your capital, better use of your resources. You get an enormous amount of identification with this common language from this communicating. You begin to relate to what the boss is trying to say, and you can agree with it or disagree with it, but it gives you an opportunity to have a mechanism that you can either push back up if you do disagree and point out why, or you can absorb and then you can take it as your marching orders, as your way forward for making innovation work. That's a very powerful, for me, it's as you said, Jeffrey, it's understated, but it's a very powerful mechanism to make innovation work.
Yeah, and I think you did a good job there of summarizing some of the benefits, removing some of the barriers, removing some obstacles, creating greater transparency. And you'll notice I've used that word several times if you watch the other videos. To me, a lot of this is about simplifying and creating greater transparency and reducing risk so that companies can innovate more effectively. And ultimately, that's what we're trying to do, is create an environment in an organization in which it's simpler, more possible, and more practical to do innovation more effectively. And all those things lead up to the fact that you need to be able to speak, communicate, and create context around both your innovation process, the innovation work you're trying to do, and its intended outcomes. So Paul, I'm going to wrap it up here. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, two particularly. You've just hit on the reason why we designed the work map. Is the very nature of to help everybody understand that they do need to think about governance. They do need to think about structures and functions and design. They need to think about the alignment. They do need to think about common language. And by having a work match which prompts each of these segments does give much better value, and it gives the greatest opportunity to then have a common, repeatable, scalable approach to innovation. It gets you closer to that objective. And that's what leadership wants. And that's equally what people who are working on innovation want.
I think you've wrapped it up very well there, Paul. I don't have much more. Any last thoughts?
No, I think we should cut out while we can, Jeffrey, don't you? This is all I want to say. Look, this is the last we have within this series we've had a series of 5. We stayed on one side of the work map more specifically. we left untouched at this moment of time culture, environment, metrics, motivations. Those are as rich in what we could offer as the other sides. But I think, we've done a pretty good job of getting people to be aware and alert of what a work map is about and what value it gives them.
Hopefully some people will watch and learn and be able to apply some of the things we're talking about to their businesses. And I'm throwing a little plug for both of us here. If you have questions, you're welcome to contact me. I'm at innovateonpurpose@gmail.com if you want to reach me. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, again, on Twitter, I'm under innovating, Paul for innovating. Don't even know my own tag here. But put my name in, Paul Hobcraft, and you're going to be able to find a way to contact me. If hopefully you will, because we've got a lot of things that we think we can help you in getting your innovation more effective and more valued.
Okay, Paul, great to talk to you. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Take care, Jeffrey.